getting those hazard characters in there and then showing them repeat allows us to demonstrate that character growth over time in a way that doesn't feel heavy-handed to the reader.
Hey, Writing Pursuits authors, welcome back to the podcast. If you're new around here, my name is Catrice McKee, and I'm glad you're here. Today, we're going to have Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor, on the program, and I'm very excited.
Yes,
So, Jeff Elkins,
exactly.
Jeff Elkins is the author of 11 novels, the host of the Dialogue Doctor podcast, and a writing coach. Since launching the Dialogue Doctor in 2020, he's held more than 200 coaching sessions. Wow. With authors, helping them write dialogue and create characters that will engage readers, which is the main thing. Jeff is also the author of The Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now. Great title, by the way. How to Write Dialogue and Characters Readers Will Love. A primer on all the Dialogue Doctor community has learned about writing great dialogue. So, wow. 200.
Yeah, it's been wild. It's been, I mean, first off, I'm fortunate that so many authors have been willing to do sessions with me. But
Right.
yeah, there's been weeks where I'll do like 7 sessions in a week. It's a lot. So it's been a wild 2.5 year ride of learning about dialogue. And we have a community at the Dialogue Doctor called the Dialoguers. The book is very much what we've learned from the community and from all of these sessions. I read a lot, and I read a lot of fiction and a lot of masterworks, but
Right.
the way the theories in the book kind of came about was we would have a problem either that would arise in an editing session, or somebody in the community would be like, I'm struggling to do this thing. And then, I would sit down and kind of try to figure out a solution or figure out new tools we could use to get that thing to work. And then once we came up with some new tools, we'd go test them, and I'd go read a bunch of masterworks. I have about 20 that are go-tos that I'm like, all right, whenever we come up with a tool, I'm going to look at like The Sun Also Rises, and I'm going to look at Beloved, and I'm going to look at, some of these works that we think of as like, or I'm going to look at Pride and Prejudice, these works that we say like, okay, these are quote unquote master works of dialogue, and see how if the tool aligns there, if it's something they're doing. The tools that we've laid out in this book are ones that we found like, yeah, these are used across those. We're just putting names to something that already exists. This happens in all of these stories.
Well, that's very helpful though, because now when you don't have the time to go do a coaching session, you can refer people to the book, and people that can't, connect in some other way will be able to go, take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's part of the goal. The hope I have with Dialogue Doctor is that I can just give writers the tools they need to write the stories they want to write. Right? Like my goal is to come alongside you and provide for you the support you need to get that story that's in your imagination on the page and then into the reader's imagination. Because it's kind of a two-step process. First, you got to get it on the page in a way that's going to get it on the reader's imagination. So the goal is like helping writers do that. Not everybody listens to a podcast, right? Like we talk about all of this stuff on the Dialogue Doctor podcast. Not everybody listens to a podcast. Not everybody either has money for a coaching session or wants to wait around every blue moon when I give away free coaching sessions in the newsletter. Like not everybody has time or the effort to do that. So this is just another way to get what we're learning at the Dialogue Doctor out into writers' hands to try to help writers create the story they want to create.
Cool. So I have a couple of questions, like, and I think I know the answers, but I just think that maybe we need to talk about them.
You've been around me enough that you know.
I do. So what is the difference between dialogue and exposition, and how do these two forms of writers like impact the reader's experience?
Yeah, so dialogue is any time in a book a character interacts with another character. So character interactions or dialogue, and it's a weird term. Dialogue is one of those terms that everybody knows, but we never define.
Right.
It's just, oh yeah, you know what that is. So, really nailing it down, it's like, well, it's when characters are interacting in a scene. That's when you have dialogue. Exposition is things that are not character interaction. So that would be like reflections or summaries of like history or summaries of happenings, descriptions of things that don't serve the character interaction, right? Like, so if you're like describing the room or describing the setting or things like that, those are all exposition. The way they work is dialogue zooms readers into the scene, meaning that like dialogue makes a reader feel like they're present, like they're there. It's what readers show up for. They show up to like live this experience with characters, and that's what dialogue does. It allows the reader to like take this emotional journey with the characters, whereas exposition serves a different purpose. It zooms us out of the scene, and it makes it so that we're looking down on the scene in that reflective mode. So both are valuable, both are important. The key is to know like what they're doing, so you can decide when I want to get a reader into the scene and when do I want my reader to pause for a minute and like zoom out and reflect on everything that's happening.
So I would go so far as to say that exposition is context and dialogue is pretty much everything else. And I think I've heard you say in the past, and I'm guessing you're including like beats as part of the dialogue, right?
Yeah.
I've heard you say that like dialogue should be about 80%.
Well, when I first started the Dialogue Doctor, I went and grabbed a whole like 20 books that are bestsellers over long periods of time. I took a look at them and I found that like, yeah, there's 60, 70, and 80% dialogue, regardless of genre or decade they were written in, because that's what draws us into story.
So a span of 60 to 80.
Yeah, so a span of 60 to 80. If you work with me as a coach, I coach you to 80% dialogue. Now I find a lot of genre readers, especially like action readers, sci-fi readers, they are more comfortable at like 70%, 60, 70%. Sci-fi readers like their spaceships, so it's like 60, 70% dialogue. But it's still well over 50. So what we coach at the Dialogue Doctor is like, hey, let's write a dialogue-centric draft, or what I've started referring to as a screenplay ready draft. Let's write a draft of your book that's screenplay ready, and then you can come back if you need to and add more exposition. You can add more inner thought, you can add more dialogue, you can add more stuff like that. But I'm sorry, you can add more inner thought, you can add more description, you can add more reflection, you can add more summaries, all that kind of stuff amongst the dialogue is what I meant to say. But we need to get your scenes grounded in dialogue so that your scenes are characters interacting. Once we have your scenes grounded in dialogue, you have the freedom to, decide when in the book you want to slow things down.
Okay, I got you. So when you're talking about dialogue, what is a character voice and how do we build a dynamic cast of characters or voices that will excite readers?
Yeah. Nice question. So when we're talking about dialogue, like, dialogue breaks into three things. It's vocalizations, which is what comes out of the character's mouth, body language, and then dialogue.
Language.
Yeah.
That's huge.
And then dialogue tags. And so when you're talking about a character voice, what we want to do is we want to think about the personality of the character. And I go into more detail on this in the book, but you think about the personality of the character, and then the character voice is how we're structuring the vocalizations, the body language, and the dialogue tags to bring that personality to life on the page. So, or you can think about it. We talk about character voices kind of having 5 components to it. There's topics, words, the topics the character talks about, the words the character says, the body language the character uses, like how the character takes up space. This is a misnomer, but a lot of times, let me pause here for a second. A lot of times writers think that body language is about emotion, like displaying emotion, but it's personality first and then emotion. So body language can communicate a change in emotion, but it has to be grounded in personality. So, a bubbly character is rarely going to look at the ground and put their hands in their pockets, right? Because bubbly characters who talk with their hands, that motion is very unnatural to them. So they need a huge emotional swing to actually do that, right? Whereas a shy character is rarely going to wave their hands in the air.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and they might if they're trying to like wave down a fire truck, right? Like if the house is on fire, they might, but they're not going to do it just because they're excited in a conversation, or they're not going to jump up and down, right? Like, so it's personality first and then emotional resonance. And then the last two pieces are like the construction of the utterance, which is how are you arranging the vocalization? Are they short sentences or long sentences? Do they have a lot of commas? Do they use no commas? Do they end everything in question marks, right? Like, how do they do that? How do we construct that vocalization on the page? And that last one is, how often are they participating in a scene vocally, if the scene has more than two people in it?
I find that that's very, very hard for especially for beginners to do, is anything more than 3 characters, and the wheels can come off,
They can. It's so tough. And there's those I call those big cast scenes, scenes of 3 to 5 people we call big cast. And then if you get over a 6 or more,
yes, I
say that you got to start writing a chorus scene. So you have to start grouping characters into groups. You can kind of think of it as like a phone number, right? Like the reason U.S. phone numbers are broken into 3, 3, and 4 is because the phone company realized, like, hey, this is the maximum amount of numbers people can remember.
As much as we can hold in our heads.
Yeah, it's as much as we can hold in our heads. Like you get past that and we're like, okay, now it's just a weird, string of things. So, it's the same with characters in a scene. The more characters you have, the harder it is for the reader to imagine the scene, the more skill it takes. But I tell you, there are writers that do it exceptionally well. Like TJ Klune is one who just writes these amazing big cast scenes. Like most of his book, Life of Puppets, his newest novel, it is 4 characters in a scene at a time, and often they'll add like 2 or 3 more. So you're looking at like scenes with like 5 to 6 characters. Or Under the Cerulean Sea has all these scenes with the 5 children and then 2 adults, so it's sometimes 3 adults, so 7 or 8 characters at a time. And it is a, like, if you want to see a master at work, he is one to watch, who like to read, watch him like balance, organize those big cast scenes. We just read in the Dialogue Doctor community, the dialoguers, and I just read Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give, and she's another one. Man, she has these scenes of like 5, 6 characters. The whole ending climax are a string of scenes with like 6, 7, and 8 characters at a time, and she just balances them so well. But it is hard, and there's craft to it, and there's things you got to pay attention to, like make sure it works for the reader's imagination.
I have a question about that, because when you get, let's say, 6 characters on a page, and I just had a book where there were like frequently there were 6 characters on a page, and it fell into this pattern where it was either Sally said, Bent said, whatever said, or it was Sally nodded, line, Dawn did this, line. And it went on, and every paragraph started to begin with a character's name or had it
can get tough. It can get tough. And the key is to work that like body language. The key is to understand how your vocalizations sound coming out of the character's mouth. That's the first thing, because you can work your tags and your body language into the middle of vocalizations, as long as you're finding the right beat of that vocalization.
Or as long as your word choices, like it sounds like the character, it is something they would say and the way they would say
Absolutely. And so
Okay.
having dynamic character voices really helps with that, because if you have, let's say you have a scene of, well, let's look at TJ Klune's Under the Cerulean Sea, where he's got a scene of like 8 characters at a time. Of those 8 characters, one of them is nonverbal and just communicating in chirps and body language. So if something chirps, you know that that's that character. So now we're down to 7, right? That we got to use tags with.
Right.
One of them has a very distinct voice and in the topics that he discusses, right? Like he's obsessed with bellhops. So if somebody has a line about a bellhop, you know it's that character. So like now we're down to 5, right? Like one of them is the Antichrist and is constantly talking about setting things on fire and burning them and maiming people. Again, another one that we can like, okay, every once in a while, this character can stand without a dialogue tag or without body language, because we know that specific vocalization belongs to Lucy, right? Like no one else is going to say that. And if somebody else does say it, you need to recognize that that's them. So now we're down to, 4. Well, a 4-person conversation is way more manageable, especially if you're spacing in these other characters that don't necessarily need the tag or the vocalization or the body language. But even with those 4, another key, I think another mistake writers make, and I do talk about this a little bit in the book, another mistake writers make with these big, large scenes is they think that in every segment, so every portion of the conversation, every character has to be involved. And like in a routine. So like you have to have character A, character B, character C, character D, character A, character B, character C, charter D, character A, character B, character C, character D. And then you're like, okay, wow, this isn't how real conversations work, right? Like
there
A
are
and
bystanders.
Yeah, A and B are going to talk a lot more, and C and D are just going to not. Right. So the key is like let A and B have the conversation, and then every couple segments touch back in with C and D and just let us know how they feel about what's going on through their body language. But you don't need to put them all together. And if you've got 8 characters in a scene, consider grouping some of them together in a chorus. And what a chorus, speaking of chorus, is like the Greek chorus in Greek literature, where a bunch of people stood on the stage and spoke in unison, right? Like consider, so going back to the example of House Under the Cerulean Sea, in one of the later chapters, Clune has a mob scene. And so you've got 2 characters in the mob that kind of represent the mob, and they have their own voices coming out of the mob. And then you have 3 characters kind of standing against the mob. And then you've got the mob. And it says like the mob yelled, the mob shouted, the mob stomped their feet, right? Like what you're doing is you're taking a whole ton of characters and you're putting them into a chorus so that they operate as a single character. And that way you can cut down on the number of voices you have to manage. You can manage a group as a single character. So you don't have to have a mob to do that. You can be like, JP, Rhineflesh and I write a Vela together. And there's 2 characters that I will often group together. Mm-hmm. And, it's Doris and Trevor, blah, blah, blah. And so like they usually respond to things the same way. They typically have similar opinions on things. So I can put them together when Doris and Trevor laughed. Right. Like, so I don't have to have like a Doris laughed and Trevor laughed. Like I can drop them into a chorus. They can operate as a single character. So the key is like trying to group characters in that way so that you can check in with them and not have to like keep bringing them back in the conversation all the time.
Well, and I think sometimes one character will speak for both.
Yeah.
Because at a certain point, the reader's going to know that they have similar opinions, and if one of them doesn't disagree, well, then they obviously kind of agree, So that's a good way to do that. Why are the terms hero, villain, and side character, because we were talking about all these things, not helpful when it comes to designing your character's growth?
Yeah, so this is something we talk about at the end of the book. One of the problems we were having in the community is we would sit down to like plot out the novel.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, the problem would be like, my character doesn't grow and I don't understand my themes.
Ah,
All right, like I'm struggling with the themes of my book and my character's not growing. So I'd be like, well, if we can figure out how your character is going to grow, we can go from there to your themes, right? Like, so if your character is moving from innocence to adulthood, then your one of your themes is coming of age, right? Like if your character is struggling with um coping with their depression and finding healthy ways to cope with your depression, then a theme is depression, right? Like, so we find our themes by finding how our character grows. And so
right.
if we started looking at it and be like, okay, well, so who's encouraging your character to grow and who's hindering your character to grow, so that when we build a scene, we can say like, okay, I need my character to struggle here. I got to put something in the scene to hinder. And be like, well, this is the villain, but the villain doesn't really hinder character growth. The villain kind of encourages character growth, and she's not really the villain, not really. Like, she's actually just, misunderstood, and she's got, this. She has her own perspective, and this is the best friend. So I guess if I need an ally in this scene, I should get the best friend. But the best friend's actually kind of a jerk and doesn't really like get along with the character, and this character is going to be the villain at the first of the book, but then by the time of the end of the book, the character is actually going to be redeemed.
Right.
So I just described like some problems in Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give, right? Because there are no villains, there are no there is a hero, but the allies aren't always allies, the villains aren't always villains. People are constantly trading places in the book, which is great. It makes for a super dynamic story, but it stinks when we talk about how do you get her character to grow,
right,
in comparison to these other characters, because it makes all of the characters feel a little schizophrenic. So because sometimes this character's helping, sometimes this character's hurting what's going on. So we started using the terms engine and anchor. Engine being, not your lead character, but other characters that help your lead character grow are engines. They help your character go. And then anchors are characters that hold your character back. Right. So,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So if you want a scene where your character is going to be tempted to behave as the worst version of themselves and not grow, or remain static and not grow, put an anchor in the scene. And then you have somebody who's going to encourage that character not to grow. Now, that anchor might be the villain. That anchor might be an ally. That anchor might be, that anchor could be the character's mom. That anchor could be the character's best friend, right? Like in The Hate You Give, one of the anchors is the character's best friend at school, right? Like every time she comes around, Star, the lead character, is tempted to be the worst version of herself. Right. Like, so it's that. And then if you want to see
way of doing things, right?
Yeah. If you want a scene where you want your character to be conflicted, put them in a scene with an engine and an anchor, right? Like, and let the engine and the anchor fight it out. So like Lord of the Rings, we have this in the Lord of the Rings saga, which people love. There is this like section of the book, this plot line of the book that is very slow in comparison to the other plot lines. And it is Sam and Frodo marching to Mordor.
Right.
And it's a lot of walking through swamps.
Walking and
trudging through the desert. And Sam is an engine to Frodo. Sam is constantly like, let's go, let's do it. We got this. We can do this, right? Like, Mr. Frodo, you've got to keep going. You can't give up. What about the Shire? Remember the things you love. If it's just Sam and Frodo, then we are on an encouraging and slow walk with little conflict besides will they catch us, which stops being fun after the third time you don't get caught. Right. So that what you do is you take an anchor in Gollum and you throw Gollum into the mix, or Smeagol. And now you've got a character who's constantly telling Frodo, take the ring for yourself, become the worst version of yourself. It's our precious. We can have it. Stop sharing it with the filthy hobbitses. And then you've got Sam that's like, hey, we got to keep going to the Shire. And now you have conflict in every scene just with the presence of these two characters.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So I see in your book that there's vehicle, engine, anchor, and hazard. What are the vehicle and the hazard?
Oh, so we talk about the vehicle as your lead character because they're the character you're on the emotional journey with.
Right.
And then the hazard just a fun. A lot of times in when I'm working with authors, they'll have like side characters.
Right. You did that third character or whatever.
Yeah, and the side character, well, like, you'll have your two characters are in an Uber, and there's an Uber driver. And a lot of times the scene will be a little bland because you gotta get like your engine encouraging your vehicle in the back of an Uber. Right. Like, and it's like, yeah, you have to have this scene, you have to have this moment of encouragement, but not a lot of fun is happening. Right. Like, so if you want the scene to be more fun, make use of that side character and turn them into a hazard. Make their voice super big, take one trait from their voice and blow it up. Make them big and loud. And then they're either super shy, or they're super passionate about something, or they're, super nerdy, or they're super, take a trait from them, make it huge, blow their voice up. And now you have a hazard in your character's journey that your character has to navigate around it during the scene. So it just makes the scene more fun. Like Save the Cat does this too in their plotting line. They'll say like, okay, now whenever you have a slow point in the plot, put a pope in the pool. Right, like put something crazy happening in the background. And so it's the same here. Like if you've got a scene that feels kind of duddish, and then you've got your two characters sitting in a coffee house trying to have a serious conversation, but you're like, man, I don't want this to feel so heavy. Make the waitress fun, right? Like make the barista a big hazard character that your vehicle is going to have to swerve around in order to create a scene. And what I find, what's funny about us as writers is when we successfully write a hazard character, we end up wanting to bring them back all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they're super fun to write.
It's fun to do.
Yeah, they're super fun to write. So we're constantly wanting to bring them back. So, they end up being a great tool for character growth because you have a repeated scene with the hazard character. You can put them at it multiple times in your book, and we can see how your lead character responds to them differently
and grows
each
along
time.
The way.
And grows along the way. So
I love it.
One of my favorite authors, Friedrich Bachmann, who wrote A Man Called Ove, he has a repeated scene at the beginning and the end of the book where Ove goes to the Apple store to try to get his iPad fixed. And the Apple store employee is definitely a hazard character. He is a, generations separated from Ove and just the pure stereotype of that generation. And so the first time Ove goes in, he gets angry and he ends up not getting what he needs and he's mad and he kind of storms off. The second time he goes in with a friend, and we see that Ove has grown. He's learned to embrace community, which is a big part of the plot of Ove's character growth. So it's that getting those hazard characters in there and then showing them repeat allows us to demonstrate that character growth over time in a way that doesn't feel heavy-handed to the reader.
Right.
Like it doesn't feel like something, the reader's not like, oh, I see what you're doing here. The reader's just enjoying the scene.
It seems organic.
If you want to see this, if you want to see this on steroids, the old movie with Bill Murray, Groundhog Day.
Right. Oh my goodness.
Is Bill Murray, his love interest, and then an entire cast of hazard characters. He just keeps, they're all big personalities. They're one note, right? Like, and he just keeps encountering them over and over and over again. And that's the whole movie. Yeah. Ned Flanders, right? Like it's just this like constant, let's repeat the same characters over and over, and we can see Bill Murray like change around them. So
change and grow.
Change and grow as he encounters them over and over, finally becoming the kind of person who could like function in this community in a positive way.
Right. And actually deserve the girl,
Yeah. I mean, maybe I have questions about the ethics of that movie, but It's great for hazard characters, not so great for morality. But that's a whole different question.
Especially the part about the piano,
Yeah. Yeah. So weird.
He
Yeah.
totally convinces that piano teacher that she did.
Yeah. And it's funny, there's a theory online, or not a theory. There are blogs online dedicated to figuring out how long he is in that movie.
It has to be a while.
It is hundreds of years to do the things that the skills that he masters, hundreds of years of living that same day over and over again.
Oh, awful.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, but fun to watch.
Yeah.
So when you pull him back to the dialogue and the balance between dialogue and exposition, how should dialogue look in your novel? And I think it does have an appearance.
It does. I feel like, well, the first thing I do when I edit a piece is I just open the Word doc up and scan it. Because I can tell like, oh, if this is exposition heavy, I'm going to see a whole bunch of heavy paragraphs, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. I tell writers like, hey, try to keep it less than 8. If you can keep it less than 5, 3 to 5 is kind of the sweet spot of like how many expositional paragraphs you can have in a row. Try to keep it less than 8, but I'll get documents, especially in like fantasy and sci-fi, where we're like 15 to 20 paragraphs in.
We are 3 pages in before we have a line.
Before we have a line of somebody talking. But the best writers, I just picked up a John Grisham. He has a book of short stories. He's one that I grew up with. I love reading his work. And I was just, again, like every time I pick up a new book by a writer who's, made an impact, I'm always like, I wonder if these things play out. So I picked it up and I was reading it, and sure enough, he never goes more than 5 paragraphs without having somebody speak to somebody else. And it's not necessarily that we need them speaking, it's that we need them interacting with each other, right? Like we need a scene, we need a moment where they can get together. So when I'm looking at dialogue and exposition, the first thing I do is I skim the page with my eye, and I can tell like, okay, there's a lot of exposition here. We got to figure out why. There's not enough dialogue. The other thing I can see right away is like, are you giving me good segments of dialogue? Are there like good interchanges between characters, or are you breaking those interchanges up with exposition in between? So a lot of times authors will write like, good, exchange. Character A says this, character B says this, paragraph of summary of character A's thoughts. Character B says this, character A says this, paragraph of summary of character A's thoughts. And when you drop in those paragraphs, you lose all of that great energy you're getting from these characters interacting that the reader really wants to be present. You keep zooming in and out of the scene. You're going to give the reader whiplash by like pulling them in the scene, pulling them out of the scene, pulling them in, pulling them out. So when I scan a document, I'm like, all right, do we have a ton of exposition? Do we have good segments of dialogue where I can be like, I can see in this manuscript where the characters are interacting? If I can get those 2 things down, then we have something to work with. Otherwise, I'm having to do like scene reconstruction. I'm having to do like, all right, we're going to rebuild these scenes from scratch.
Right. And I have, I've seen people who are very able to have a single character on the page and it's very dynamic, but there's generally something else going on in the background to help them along, and they're interacting with their environment in some way, and also maybe having an inner exchange. But that's pretty much the only time I want to see them kind of alone. Is if they're really fighting it out with themselves and there's a dog that they can talk to.
I was working with one author. Well, so the ideal is characters interacting because we get the exchange of emotions and expectations between the 2 characters. If you really have a lone wolf character who's by themselves all the time, then there are some cheats you can use to like substitute that character interacting. You can get them talking to inanimate objects, right? Like you can get them talking to things that are around them that they deal with. Like, I think a famous example, Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway.
Right.
We cannot watch him for 2 hours on a beach by himself. We'll go insane. Nobody will tolerate that. So they gave him a volleyball, they put a face on it. He has the most dynamic conversations with this stupid volleyball. And the way they do it is that the volleyball actually at times looks like it's responding to him. So it's that, like, you know, you can get them talking to inanimate objects. A lot of times I'll see authors have them talk to pets or talk to other animals that don't respond, but kind of get like a personalization. That's not the right word. Personification. There we go. That they give,
Right.
they give the animal a personification where it's not speaking, but it's cocking its head. It's, whining, it's barking.
Or if they're like me, they actually say the lines for the animal. Which my animals are always talking to me because I give them voices.
Yeah, why not? But it's that key to like have your getting us in the scene by showing the character interacting with something. Andy Weir's The Martian.
Right.
He interacts with all kinds of things. And the better example, though, I think, is his book, Holy Grail? No, Hail Mary.
Hail Mary.
That's it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's
Hail Mary Project. Yeah, where he's constantly interacting with his spaceship and he's talking to it. It has a computer voice that talks back to him, but he's talking to it even when the computer voice doesn't interact. And then an alien comes into play that can't talk back with him, but they're interacting constantly, and their interactions are so interesting. And that's what we want. We want, the thing about interactions is that it's not that people talking is some magic thing where it's like, oh my gosh, we got to be talking. It's that character interactions drive us into a scene, and we want to be in the scene. The easiest way to do that is to get characters interacting. And if you don't have two characters to interact, you got to start figuring out, like, don't have two characters talk to each other. You got to start figuring out, like, okay, what is the lead character interacting with? What's the vehicle interacting with that allows the vehicle to communicate expectations and emotions?
Right.
I've seen books where the vehicle talks to themselves, and you have their inner thought and their exterior vocalization, right? Like, so they're literally having a conversation with themselves. Like, it's, but you just have to get that vehicle interacting with something.
And when he says vehicle, he means like the main character.
The main character. Yeah, the lead character.
Let's
just
get that straight.
Sorry about that.
Not the spaceship.
I folded the dialogue, Dr. Lingo, the dialoguers, the main character. Yeah, not the vehicle. Yeah, the main character. Get them like interacting with something.
I love that. Yeah, and I thought that the Tom Hanks Castaway example was really great, and people should go study it when they're. How am I going to write my characters' solitary scenes? Because there's almost always one scene where they really need to kind of be alone with themselves and figuring stuff out. But that doesn't mean you can't add hardship, and interaction with the environment, and
again, I would
and
I would encourage you, don't have one.
Right.
If you're gonna have one, have several, because we want to see the character change over time. So you have to give us those repeated scenes so we can see that changing come over time. So don't just, if the character is going to talk to their car, don't talk to the car once. Talk to the car 4 times. Have 4 conversations with the car. So we can see at the beginning and at the end how the conversation with the car changes over time, right? Like, if your character is going to talk to the dog, don't just talk to the dog one time. Right. Talk to the dog multiple times so that we can see, in The House Under the Cerulean Sea, the character Linus is alone a lot. He talks to his cat, and the cat is definitely personified in its body language to Linus, right? Like, so it's that, like, figuring out how to get that character interacting with something, I think is so important for those lone wolf, for those lonely, isolated characters.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
Like, in the process of writing a book, do you recommend just writing from the top? Just writing from the top as it comes to you, scenes, exposition, dialogue, whatever, or do you, in your personal writing, do you do it like a screenplay where you're writing the dialogue and maybe a couple of beats along the way?
I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. The first way, I'm going to answer is like, how do I recommend you write? The second one, I'll give you an exercise to improve your dialogue. So, I recommend you write in whatever way motivates you to write. Writing is hard enough. If you're big into plotting, like I'm a big plotter, I cannot start a book until I have a spreadsheet. And my spreadsheet will have every major plot point. Now, as I'm writing, they all change. I can't start until I know where I'm going.
Right.
That's part of my personality. I also can't go on a trip until I know where I'm going, right? Like it's part of who I am. I know writers who, like, if they know where they're going, they feel like they've already been there. So they can't know where they're going. They have to just sit down and start writing and figure it out as they go. That is also beautiful. If that's what excites you, do that. The key is, however you write, whatever way you're motivated to write, keep the dialogue centric, keep the character interactions, like zooming into scenes, the majority of what you're doing. So if you're a plotter, I tell writers, like, okay, every scene you plot, it has to be this character and this character are what, or like these characters are what, right? Like we got to get that conflict. We have to get that scene described as the characters interacting. Just go ahead and do it in your plot. Jake meets with X character and this happens, or like, Jess goes to find a new apartment, and don't stop there. Be like, and sits down on a couch with Coach Nick and Schmidt and they interview her, right? Like take your plot beat all the way to the character interaction, because that's the scene you're actually writing. Don't stop with Jess goes to find an apartment. Give us like what happens, like go ahead and plot out what happens. If you're a pantser, start with the characters talking to each other. You can always come back later and add in whatever scene, or whatever description you need or summary you need. Or if you have to start with a summary, because I know I've worked with writers that are like, I have to summarize what's been happening before this scene to get into the scene. I'll be like, great, write your 4-paragraph summary, get into the scene, and then before you save it, go delete those first 4 paragraphs. Like if that's what you got to do to write, do what you got to do to write.
Right.
But just be ready to, like, I'm deleting all of that. Like for me, I have a weird thing in my brain. I have to start a scene describing the room. It's the weirdest thing. I cannot not do it. Every scene I write, I start describing the room they're in. And so I've just learned
to the rule, though, because I have seen so many writers who they're just, blah, 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 blah. And you don't know where they are. You don't know where they are.
You got to give them spatial context. Yeah. Well, in the book, I talk about you need 4 things in a scene. You need spatial context. You need this. We talk about it as in the dialoguer community as like the stage of the reader's imagination. So in the book, I talk about the stage of the reader's imagination. On that stage, I have to have the scenery. I have to have the characters. I have to know who's in the room. You have to tell me who's there. Do not surprise me 3 pages in that Carlos has been here the whole time. Don't do that. If Carlos has been there the whole time, I better know a couple paragraphs in that Carlos is also here.
Right.
I don't need Carlos talking. Carlos sitting over in the corner silently brooding. That's fine. I just need to know that he's there in the room, because his presence in the room changes the scene. So if he's not there, like if you give him to me 3 pages in, then I have to reimagine the whole scene. Oh crap, Carlos has been here the whole time. Ew. So no wonder Willie was acting really weird. So that's like, I need the scenery. I need who's in the room. I need the emotional tone. I need to understand how I'm supposed to feel about this, specifically how that vehicle character, that lead character feels about what's going on. I need to know that. And I need to know what the conflict is. I need to know, and all 4 of those things I got to know early. I got to know, like, what is the problem here that this scene is trying to solve. So if I can get those 4, but that being said, there is an exercise I encourage writers to do, which I tell writers, if you write 10,000 words this way, my experience is you'll never go back. So you'll never go back to writing your normal way. You'll never go back to writing non-dialogue centric scenes.
Right.
So write 10,000 words. Yeah. Write 10 scenes to 10. Cause I find writers typically write 2,000 to 3,000 words in a sitting.
I do.
Yeah. Right. Write for 10 times, write only the dialogue. Initial the character's name, what they say. Initial the character's name, what they say. Initial what they say. Initial what they say. And then after you write only the dialogue, then come back and fill in the exposition you need. If you, and then you can be done with your scene. If you do that 10 times, you will transform how you see scenes, because
Right.
you will start thinking, okay, what are we talking about? What are we talking about in this scene? And you'll start getting there. And that now, so more than ever, because we're living in this golden age of visual media.
Visual media. I was going to say the same thing, where we can binge to our heart's desire,
Mhm.
and if it's not gripping, we can turn it off and go somewhere else.
Absolutely. I realized that this was just a couple weeks ago. I realized, like, oh crap, I live in Baltimore and I love Baltimore. There's a Baltimore movie named The Diner that's very famous that launched a ton of careers that I've never seen. I was like, I should go watch that. I had it in 30 seconds.
Oh.
Right? Like, it is a movie from the 80s. There's no reason. When I was a teenager, if I wanted to watch The Diner, I might have to go to like 2 to 3 different Blockbusters to find the one that might have it in stock.
Right.
And then I could rent it. But I can get up and hold of whatever I want. And so knowing that, we just have to take into account that, like, our books need to feel more like movies than they have before.
Right.
And that's, so that means they have to be dialogue centric. They have to be screenplay ready. So I encourage writers, like, take 10 turns, take 10 writing sessions, and just write it as a screenplay first. You don't have to do all the formatting. You don't have to do the, like, log lines at the beginning. None of that.
Yeah,
I don't want any of that. I just want you to write the characters talking first, and then come back and fill in the exposition. And it'll change how you write. After you do it 10 times, you can go back to writing how you normally do.
I actually tried that experiment, by the way. So
did you? How did it work?
Yeah, it worked great. And I mean, I thought it strengthened my grasp of writing entirely. I mean, I've written 5 books, and I'm writing a 6th, and the 6th one is the one I did that with. I just used it as an experiment.
Nice.
And I can testify here.
That makes me super happy. Thank you for sharing that. That really makes me happy.
And all those things about the big scenes with a lot of characters, I bit off more than I could chew. There where I had like 6 or 7 people on the stage almost all the time. But like you say, after struggling, it was, split them into groups, have some that are on stage, have some that are off stage. If they come across the stage, well, then, that's fine. But,
yeah. What's been an interesting byproduct of all of this work I've done over the last 2.5 years on, like, understanding dialogue and building these tools, and, it's down. I appreciate the masters so much more than I used to.
Right. Like, now you know why they're great.
Now I know why they're great. Now when I pick up a Stephen King novel, I'm like, man, this guy nails character interactions. He crushes character interactions. He makes you feel so much that his lead characters feel. And you're like, yeah, that's why. Yeah, he writes horror. Yeah, he's, he kind of defined the horror genre. Yeah. But the reason he could do all that is because this guy can just slam character interactions. All right. I read Toni Morrison, and I'm like, yeah, Toni Morrison stands the test of time. We continue to read her work. Beloved is a forever classic because Toni Morrison can write a hell of some great dialogue. Like, wow. It's just, and you're just her characters, Sethi and Paul D and Denver have such amazing voices, and Beloved, the 4 characters in the book have such amazing voices, and there's scenes with all 4 of them in it, and they're incredible scenes. They're just, and it is reading it is like reading reading a master at work. You're like, yeah, I am watching a true artist wield these tools in a way that I can't do it on my own. Or it's like,
but you can study it, and you can
study it. Yeah, yes. I study it, I read it, I improve it, I watch it, and I'm like, man, this is incredible. Or I tease the dialogue. We have a running joke in the Dialogue Doctor community that, I always bring up Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, because it is the prime example of a book with no plot, It has no plot. It is just it is a insanely long book of scenes that are taken completely out of space and time. They are just there's actually a mathematical formula one of the dialoguers sent me one time that like, well, if you do this mathematical equation and rearrange the chapters based on this equation, you can find the plot of the book. And so I was like, I'm not doing that. But people love that book. And the reason they love that book is because he is a master of dialogue. There's a scene, one of the opening chapters, there's a scene of a character who is being talked at by, he's a tennis player, and he's being talked at by his parents and professors, and they're like, his coaches are there, and they're having this big conversation.
Yeah.
And as they're talking, he feels like he's having a seizure. It is the most amazing scene. The conversation is just, the dialogue is incredible. The way he works all the characters in are great. The modulation of their voices to express emotion is just flat out mesmerizing. Like it is. And you read it, you're like, yeah, that's why people read this book, even though it has no plot. Like this is, or like I really like Cormac McCarthy, has weird grammatical things going on in his books. Man, the character interactions in The Road are incredible. Right. The father and the son on The Road are just heartbreaking to watch these two characters interact. Or like I just reread Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale.
All right. Mm-hmm.
I had forgotten, talk about authentic and well-designed character voice. I had forgotten how powerful, because I watched the TV show, and the TV show and the book kind of blended in my head together. Right. I forgot how powerful the vehicle character's voice is. And she's got these scenes, these chorus scenes, where all of the handmaids are together in a room, and the two aunts, Aunt Lydia, and I can't remember the other aunt's name.
Okay, I can't either.
Yeah, are putting these women in the center of the room, and saying these, kind of having them confess their sins. Right. And then the chorus it's not called the chorus in the book, but the chorus of voices, and we all said shame, shame, shame. Right, like grouping all of the other handmaidens together in that singular voice.
Right.
And then to allow the lead character one sentence of reflection about how it felt good. And it just crushes you. Just like, but it's just that understanding. Margaret Atwood knows how to use her tools, and she is just a master craftsman swinging those tools around. And it just, I think studying dialogue in this way has not just made me a better writer, but makes me a more appreciative reader.
Well, speaking of books, so like, talk to me about the book and when and how people can get it, and
okay,
so forth.
Yeah, so the book, it's weird to transition talking about master writers to talking about my book, because this is not, but so this is the funny transition. So the book is,
don't do that. Don't fuck it.
Okay, well, so let me say, I kept it intentionally short. Right. I had a debate with some of my editors about, like, should we take all these master works we've been looking at and put it in there and make it like a Robert McKee sized book of like 700 pages.
Right.
And I was like, the problem with those is that I read them slowly, and I read them like reference material. I don't read them like a book. And so it was like, well, let's keep all of those, let's keep all of that big weighty stuff out, and let's just get to the principles. Let's keep it hard and dirty and fast, and like, hey, here's the concept, here's the tool, here's the way to use it that's good, here's some exercises to do, like here's some examples. Excellent. Here's some exercises to do. So it is an incredibly practical book. There's 8 tools you're going to pull out of it around dialogue. We go big to small. It looks at the First, it looks at like the construction of dialogue versus exposition, and then the actual like components of dialogue. And then we talk about the different types of scenes. We talk about the different ways to open scenes. And then we get into character voice. We talk about character voice. We talk about voice modulation to show emotion. We talk about voice modulation to show character growth. And then finally, we talk about cast building. And like, let's
So
put
what
together.
that tells me is that it's highly usable.
That's the goal. This is something you can read in a day and ideally walk away going like, okay, there's a couple concepts in here I can start trying immediately.
Right. I love
That's
that.
the goal.
I love
Yeah.
that.
So it's and you can get it anywhere. It's wide. So
Excellent.
right now, as of this recording, it's on pre-order as an ebook everywhere.
Where can people find you?
Oh, people can find me at thedialoguedoctor.com. That's the best place to find me. And you can find me in a lot of ways there. There's a free newsletter that comes out once a week. There's the podcast that comes out once a week. The podcast is a lot of me. Part of what I'm excited about for the book is like I said, the community's been going for 2.5 years, and we have developed our own shorthand.
Right.
And even people who like aren't part of the Patreon, who just come on the podcast to do editing sessions, it's really fascinating to me. If we listen to our early editing sessions, I do a lot of work of like, hey, don't summarize. Hey, pull this summary out. Hey, don't, let's take this summary and let's make it into a scene. I haven't done that for like a year because the people doing sessions with me have been listening for a year. So
now they have the shorthand.
Yeah, they all have the shorthand, and we'll get on a call. I realize a lot of times, like, well, this last episode I was on with Paul Terrio, and they've been a part of the community for a long time, and they are an excellent writer, and they and I have done tons of sessions together, and we were just throwing out like engine anchor vehicle hazard without explaining them. And I was like, man, I got to get this book into people's hands so that they can actually listen to the podcast. But so you can find me on the podcast. I do master classes on August 5th. I think it's August 5th is a Saturday. I'll be teaching a 4-hour master class on using the Enneagram to design character growth. So we'll talk about like the 9 archetypes, and then for 30 minutes we'll look at the 9 archetypes, and then we'll spend 3.5 hours talking about like what is character growth, how does character growth work, like how can we use these archetypes as examples of like showing characters that grow, like so so there's all kinds of places you can find me there. Okay. And then I will say, if you're going to buy the book, I recommend the paperback because there's a lot of charts in the book. And it's tough to know how big the charts are going to be on your e-reader. So if you're reading it on your phone, I cannot guarantee that the type of those charts will not be 2-point font. So, so I would, I would recommend getting the paperback because on the paperback I can control the size of the charts. So right. Yeah, and there's a lot of charts where we're like comparing things.
That's awesome. Okay, well then, that's called The Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now, How to Write Dialogue and Characters. Characters readers will love. They would get the whole subtitle. Yeah. And by Jeff Elkins, Elkins, and you can find Jeff at dialoguedoctor.com. Thank you so much for coming.
Catherice, thank you. This was fantastic. I love talking to you every time.
I enjoy it too. Well, have a great evening.
You too.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.